So governance. I've just been thinking about governance so much recently. And then just to make things worse, on the plane ride on the way here, I read David Bollier's book. You should read this book. You should really read this book. It makes a 5-hour flight go by like that. And he's very quotable in this book in particular. So I decided to pepper this presentation with some quotes by him. And one of them is just a quote about the commons, because that's a major framing of this whole conference. It's a common bound conference, and Ed Whitfield last night was talking a lot about the commons. And I think we hear so many different things about what a commons is, and I really like the way he frames it, which is that really we can create a commons out of anything if we come together with the intention to collectively manage it for our collective benefit to create equitable access over the long term. So a worker cooperative can be thought of as a commons that creates livelihoods for its stakeholders. And so it's not just about water and forests and so on. It's like we're creating the commons out of our entire economy. Everything that provides for us can become a commons. And so much of that is about governance. How do we govern something for long-term stewardship? So one thing I realized about governance is that if we want the economy to provide for the community really does have to be involved in the governance of every part of that economy. And I think we're all about to start getting involved in governance in so many more ways than we're used to. This is about creating an economy that provides for us, so we should be protagonists in that. And really the only way to ensure that it will provide for us is to be involved in governance. So here's a question. How do you absolutely ensure that a worker cooperative is going to make decisions that will benefit its workers? And I set it up like a game show because I think there's only one answer. What's the answer? Well, you know what the answer is. Yeah, put the workers in charge. I really do think that's the only answer. And there's a lot of things that do benefit workers, like labor unions and so on. But if you really want to ensure that the decisions will benefit the workers, it should be the workers making those decisions. And a lot of times that's in the form of cooperatives. And the thing about cooperatives is they have a lot of baggage. People think, oh, if you involve people in decisions, it's just going to be long meetings and it's going to be painful. But we really need to boil cooperatives down to two very important elements in their legal DNA. Cooperatives, in my mind, and in the law, involve these two elements. The board is elected on a one-member, one-vote basis. So money doesn't buy power. How novel.
You don't know whose bag this is that's ringing?
Ugh.
It's good to know.
Background music.
Oh, well.
Stop reading.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and then the other thing about cooperatives is that profits are distributed on the basis of patronage, meaning the value or the quantity of the business that you do with a cooperative, how much you work for it, how much you buy from it. So money doesn't buy you more money. Money doesn't buy power, money doesn't buy money. It's amazing, and it's kind of an ideal on which we built a country, but we've never really gotten it in our heads that we should build our businesses and our economy based on this. But so the word cooperative, as I mentioned, it does have a lot of baggage. You're going to start to hear the phrase, I hope you're going to start to hear the phrase T corporation a little more, because especially like really important sounding businessmen like to say the phrase T corporation because it sounds more important. And cooperatives are governed by the subchapter T of the Internal Revenue Code. So I just thought I'd give you that. Anyways, but one reason that cooperatives don't have to be this is that at their core, the members elect the board on a one-member, one-vote basis, meaning that the cooperative is ultimately accountable to the members. If members want to change the direction of things, then they elect a different board, they run for the board. And at the same time, I think that decision-making could, in many efficient ways, be distributed throughout organizations. And by the way, I'm not just talking about worker cooperatives. I'm talking about all kinds of organizations. And I found these big words in David Bollier's book. Subsidiarity and polycentricity is just the idea that we can try to, an ideal is to enable governance at the lowest and smallest levels possible so that people are truly engaged in driving what they're involved in. And I think that technology helps with this. There are a lot of communications tools that allow people to govern at smaller and smaller levels, and I think there are also some really interesting models that I'll talk about. And here's a quote from David Bollier. It says, thanks to innovations citizens are going to be able to participate more in governance, basically. And he said that they can do more than just participate in a preordained or rigged government agenda. They can actually initiate new ideas in their communities and assume real responsibility for that. And I think we're seeing a little bit more of that with participatory budgeting. But anyway, so I think that there's a lot of room for innovation there. But another thing about governance that I realized is that I think in all of the businesses and organizations that we're going to be part of, we folks are going to be part of in the new economy, it's not going to be profit maximization that's personally motivating to us. In the old days, that was motivating. But I think that we're going to be motivated by our ability to have satisfying work and to have a voice in things and use our creativity and to learn and to grow and build community and have fun. And the actual structure of governance can affect all of these things. Because if everybody is behind a wheel, and I don't say everybody behind the wheel, because the idea that there is sort of a polycentric governance, that governance is distributed out in organizations into smaller circles and subcircles, it does mean that everybody is behind something, that they can drive and influence their situation and their work. So, yeah, just a quick word about profit maximization and how that affects governance. Because a lot of people always say, what about B Corps and benefit corps and all of these newfangled, wonderful sounding things? And the thing that I always have to remind people is that even those corporations aren't immune to the gravitational pull of wealth accumulation. Last night I heard Ed Whitfield use the phrase insatiable drive to accumulate. Mm-hmm. And so there's always going to be a voice in the head of the people who are driving the organization. And I think that people in governance positions behave differently if they have the ability to maximize their own self-interest above that of others. So taking the profit piece out means taking that voice in the head of the entity away, the voice that might say, maybe we can buy cheaper grains or lower our expenses for employee health insurance and so on. And David Bollier said something like that. He said the commons really needs to have as much integrity and autonomy as possible, and to resist enclosure and consumerism and resist the lust for capital accumulation, because that's going to completely shift the decisions that we make. Okay, third thing about governance is that so much of what we want to do in the new economy, so many of the things you're going to hear about today, cooperatives, food cooperatives, worker co-ops, housing co-ops, time banks, community currencies, a lot of them are illegal in the sense that there's so many legal barriers to overcome, so many legal hoops to jump through that many of these projects won't be able to jump through them. But governance is going to change this, and I'll tell you why. But a lot of these legal hoops, they were designed for the old economy. Mm-hmm. And they take a lot of money to jump through. I never, anyways, yeah, I draw a lot of cartoons. So I can never resist the urge to draw a cartoon. But so here's a cartoon that sort of describes the current legal and economic system. I mean, our legal system was really designed for this economy, this old economy that we're working in, where basically people created relationships like this. This is like a grain mill. So if you want to make bread, you got to put in land and water and seeds, throw all those things into the mix. You need workers to commit their time and labor. You need consumers to spend money. And you're going to sprinkle on a little bit of pesticides. And then the shareholder elected board controls all this. So they're going to crank that wheel around and generate wealth for themselves, and over time, just accumulate a lot of money and power. And for a very, very long time, this was all okay with us because in the deal, we got jobs and food for a long time. That was actually creating jobs and food for us, to a sufficient extent. And the Constitution of the United States even says something to the effect of, go forth and do all this. Create whatever economic relationships you want. You have the freedom to contract with each other and do all this. And for a long time, our government didn't want to intervene in these relationships until roughly around the Depression. Basically, they recognized there was a lot of oppression taking place because of this imbalanced economic relationship. There was a lot being extracted, and workers had unhealthy working conditions. The companies were getting more and more rich and powerful. So they said, we are actually going to need to tinker with this system a little bit, limit these relationships a little bit. And so we got employment laws to protect the rights of workers in these arrangements. We got securities laws to protect investors. We got consumer protection laws and health and safety laws and everything else to ensure that the people, the consumers were protected. We got zoning laws to make sure that huge companies didn't just move into our neighborhoods and cause a lot of pollution and nuisance. And so that all of this has really tempered this extractive system. It's kind of put the brakes on it a little bit. And it's worth noting, by the way, even with all of these regulations, and there's a lot of them, our conditions, our living conditions, working conditions, the food we eat, and everything, it's not actually that great. The laws haven't actually protected us that well. So people like us think, well, here's what we'll do. We'll create another economy. Side by side with that economy, we'll use grocery cooperatives and worker cooperatives and basically replace that economic system. And, here's this. Oh, wait. Sorry. Let me just do that again. Look what happens a lot of times when we try to crank that wheel around. We can't turn the wheel because all of the bolts have been tightened too much. And so let's say we're creating a food cooperative. Basically, we're creating a commons to provide food for ourselves, to purchase food from each other if we're food producers, from local farmers, maybe in a food desert where we don't otherwise have access to affordable, locally grown and healthy food. But here's where the law comes in. Well, we can't volunteer 3 hours a month for the food cooperative because that would violate employment laws. We can't invest even $500 in our own food cooperative because that would violate securities laws. We can't actually sell each other food unless we put about 5 different sinks and washable floors and walls in our facility because of health and safety laws. And if we're using somebody's garage to manage all the orders and distribution, we probably can't do that because zoning laws say you can't put a grocery store in your house. And so it's important to note that the enclosure of everything, of so much of our resources in society, has also resulted in the enclosure of our money and our time and labor and our relationships and our homes and neighborhoods. It's really limited what we can do with all these things, but we need to do stuff with these things because that's how we're going to create the commons. So here's where governance comes in. Because I started to think, well, how do we loosen these bolts to enable things like cooperatives? How do we loosen them without just opening the floodgates to big companies extracting more and more? So it comes back to the system that we're operating within, the economic system, the governance structures. We just need to change a couple little things. Who's in control and who gets the profits? So taking these two things out, if we have a board that's elected by the workers or the consumers or some other stakeholder group, the stakeholder group that's meant to be protected by these laws, if they're calling the shots, and if the profit's being distributed to them on the basis of their purchases or how much they work, that just changes everything. Because the money circulates around and back to people. Overall, it's the whole purpose of it is to provide for people, to provide jobs, provide food, and it's and to use the framing that Marjorie's using, it's a generative system as opposed to an extractive system. And you put them side by side, compare and contrast. That's actually our legal wedge. We're creating two economies side by side. We need to create two legal systems side by side. But we need to figure out what is the commons and how do we identify the governance structures of them so that we can then go to lawmakers and say, this is something different. It should not be regulated in the same way. And here is the new legal framework that we need to build around it. So I like to make things memorable. One moral to the story is cooperatives, I think, are really going to be a core legal structure as we create the commons and the new legal framework for the commons. It's not just that we can't change the economy without cooperatives, it's that we can't change the legal system without them. Back to David Bollier quotes. He said the state really shouldn't become too involved in overseeing the commons because really the point of a commons is that it's self-governing. People are involved in creating it and managing it themselves. But there's me, and I say, well, the state actually does need to identify what are the basic elements of the commons and commons governance so that we can determine what is exempt from regulation and what is not. And he also said, he points out that not all commons are necessarily equitable and benign, so the state may have an important role in setting minimal governance standards and ground rules, and I think that is important. But within the current law, there's so much that we can do, and it's in the design of our organizations. Our governance structures are often manifested in things called bylaws, and as you know, bylaws are things that nobody ever really wants to read because they're written like this. Some organizations kind of go on the far opposite end of the spectrum in their approach, and they just say, yeah, let's keep it informal, then it'll be a lot easier on everybody, we'll all have a voice, blah, blah, blah. But here's a phrase that came out of, it's an essay that was written during the feminist movement. This is one of these cartoons. The tyranny of structurelessness, the idea that if you don't have structure, certain hierarchies will just naturally set in. Certain people who feel more entitled to power than others, who talk more than others, are going to pop in, and they might end up kind of just naturally taking control. This is one of those silly things that I'm like, should I include it or not? It's all, I really just try to be memorable. That's all I do. But you know, the structurelessness, you can remedy that by having very clear procedures for meetings, procedures for creating and bringing and adopting proposals and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. One thing to point out is that the law does currently dictate some of how we govern ourselves, and it depends on the entity that you choose. You know, is it a cooperative corporation, a nonprofit corporation, LLC? Each one has a code that dictates, to some extent, like how do you have elections and how do you give notice for meetings and so on. The tax status that you get, you know, 501c3 status or subchapter T for co-ops, that's going to dictate some of your governance. And for certain types of activities, one example is common interest developments, like homeowners associations usually have their own sets of governance rules that are even more intricate. In California, we have a huge long statute that governs homeowners associations. It also governs a lot of the housing co-ops and intentional communities that I work with. And a lot of my clients are very annoyed by these laws because a lot of the consensus processes that they adopt end up not quite working within the confines of the law, but honestly, these laws, they are good in many ways because they give the group due process against an individual trying to assert power. They give individuals due process when the group has too much power. There's fallback rules in case the group is too loose and doesn't adopt rules. And they're also helpful to outsiders who need to know, has this group actually made a valid, legally binding decision, and so on. But one conclusion from this is that we do need to start designing new entity structures for the commons. In California, we have a bill we're working on for worker co-ops, but even without those, there's so many things that we can do within the existing legal structures, practices that we can adopt, principles we can adopt that make all this work so much better for us. And I always like to talk about Elinor Ostrom. She's included in the handout that you'll eventually get if you don't have it already. I've started applying her principles to the worker co-ops that I represent when I draft their bylaws, because she went around the world and she studied grazing lands and fisheries to see which communities are actually being successful in managing a resource for their long-term benefit, and what are the practices that they're using that help to make that possible. And she identified these best practices, so I won't go into great detail on them, but I feel like we could apply these in so many different organizational scenarios. It's important to note that some of the goals you might have for governance will conflict with each other, because sometimes you want a high level of engagement and conversation, a lot of getting together and thinking together, but that's going to potentially conflict with your desire to be efficient. Building trust based on a sense of connection and community can sometimes be a bit undermined if you have very highly formal rules and processes, although I'm finding that to not be the case so much because my organization has very formal rules. Transparency and broad access to information can undermine your desire to protect people's privacy. And I'm going to use a couple examples. One is my organization, the Sustainable Economies Law Center. We're a nonprofit organization with a board of directors, but we run our operations a lot like a worker collective. We use this governance process called adhocracy, which I just love. You can find out more at adhocracy.org. It's funny, we just took this picture at our recent party, and then I realized how similar we looked to that cartoon that I had drawn previously, but so that's a side note. One of our clients is this company called Loconomics. It's an online platform that sees itself as part of the sharing economy. It's a freelancer-owned cooperative, so freelance service providers create a profile on the site. They can sell their services, book their services, process payments through the site. So we're working on the bylaws now and thinking through a lot of governance challenges, but this is potentially a very dispersed cooperative with members all over the state or the country, and it's an opportunity to do things that haven't been done before. So in the handout there's a list of considerations. I'm just going to talk through a few of them. Like when you're designing an organization, and again, these are some of the questions I think that New Economy Coalition probably still wants to answer for itself. Some of them have already been a little bit answered, but what are the governing bodies and what realms does each control? As Marjorie mentioned, there was bicameral governance in the case of the John Lewis Partnership. Are you going to break the organization into lots of circles of activity? This is the Sustainable Economies Law Center's current structure and how we divide out our operations into different circles. So each staff member is part of different circles, and we move about them fluidly depending on what we're most inspired to work on or where we're most needed. Each of these circles meets twice per month, and these are kind of fluid. We meet based on when we need to meet. So let's see. Credit unions also have a bit of a bicameral governance structure. They're legally required to have a board-appointed supervisory committee. It's kind of an audit committee, but they oversee a lot of other things to make sure the credit union is being run with integrity. There's also the question of how are the governing bodies elected or appointed? And this is actually very important. I've heard that a lot of rural cooperatives, rural energy cooperatives, are just kind of old boys clubs buying energy from the same old other boys clubs. And a lot of that has to do with how can members actually take control and redirect the cooperative? Some of it has to do with the simple question of how do you nominate the board candidates? How can you actually run for the board or nominate someone? REI is a consumer cooperative, but have you ever been asked to nominate a board candidate? No, because the board has already nominated the board candidates for you. So it's not a great system. It's not a great cooperative to join if you really want to influence the direction of things, because the board is going to be a little bit self-perpetuating. They're going to appoint people that they know already, and then you have the choice to elect whoever they've nominated. But it doesn't really give you a lot of power. Loconomics, here's what we're currently putting in the bylaws for their election of the directors. 5 of the seats are going to be elected by the freelancers who are the members. One of them is going to be appointed by the Sustainable Economies Law Center, and if we don't exist anymore, we're actually having the New Economy Coalition appoint the board seat. But the idea is, we don't want the cooperative to become so insular that it's just benefiting a fixed group of people. This has a broader vision of benefiting local economies and also benefiting freelancers and the working conditions of freelancers in society, which is soon to be about 40% of society. So the Freelancers Union is appointing another board seat. So every 2 years we'll be asked to appoint somebody that represents the values that we're empowered to represent on the board. Community land trusts tend to have 3 different categories of board members: the people who live on the land, the people who live surrounding the land, just community members at large, and then people with special expertise and experience in the realm of land trusts. You also want to ask who can be members of the organization. If members are the ones behind governance, then who can be a member, and do they have different powers? With Loconomics, you have to be a freelance service provider, and you have to complete a certain number of transactions before you can vote for the board. We don't want people to join just so they can influence elections. I recently did that with a local credit union. I joined so I could influence the election. But ideally, and now I take part in it actively and I care a lot about it. But
you put it on YouTube.
Ideally, people should actually be involved, be true stakeholders. And another question we have as an organization at Sustainable Economies Law Center is how much should we involve volunteers meaningfully in governance? Thank you. What are avenues for member participation? I think traditionally members of cooperatives and voting nonprofits, the way that they participate is by running for the board or electing a new board. But as I say, I think there's a lot more, especially with technology, ability to create feedback loops, to constantly integrate the ideas of members. With Loconomics, we might create petitions where members can bring ideas to the board or proposals. And then the specifics of how a proposal is adopted is really important. There's a really cool platform called Lumio. It's a worker cooperative created platform where people can bring a proposal, people give their reactions, thumbs up, neutral, no, block, and you can continue to adapt the proposal until everyone's thumbs up. And the thing about consensus, a lot of people, organizations in the new economy focus on consensus, and especially consensus by unanimity, and I really understand the thinking behind that is because we don't want to leave people behind in the new economy. We want our decisions to really include everybody, but as a lawyer for a lot of intentional communities and worker cooperatives, the ones that do consensus by unanimity often get derailed by maybe one or two individuals who are just really, really mad about something and not using the rational part of their brain to make decisions. They're just, fight or flight. So I'm going to skip through some of these slides. I'm happy to send these slides. I'll try to upload them to HackPad. Yeah. But yeah, you can also email me if you'd like the slides. But it is important to have a very clear consensus process. Make sure you have fallbacks. Make sure you know on what basis can somebody block something and how do you handle a block. Holacracy has a really great, highly structured system for bringing proposals that my organization uses. We probably bring and adopt about 5 to 8 proposals every week in our meetings. Meeting procedures are important. Holacracy also has highly structured meeting procedures that my organization enjoys. Let's see, these are just some other things that are in the handout. I do wonder a lot, when does it make sense to have an organizational structure that really is loose, an adhocracy or do-ocracy? Our local time bank in the Bay Area has been described by some of the founders as a do-ocracy. You just show up and you start doing stuff and you get involved in committees. One day you're on the board, one day you're not. And it is very loose. It's hard to say if that's a great thing. It does make everybody feel like it's their time bank. They could just jump right in and get involved. So your to-do list, become obsessed with governance, rethink the governance of everything, might as well, we're rethinking the whole economy, and participate in governance everywhere. It's really going to be, I think, become part of our lives a lot more. I think governance is life. Governance is what determines what we do. And as David Bollier probably puts it a little more articulately than I do, we're about to become protagonists in our own lives. We're going to act as if we have inalienable stakes in the world into which we were born, and we can insert the human right and capacity to participate in managing resources critical to our lives. So don't forget to read his book. And so here's what we're going to do. We have a couple different conversations we want to have. One is we just want people in small groups of 2 or 3 to kind of turn to each other and talk about, what does this have to do with you? What has this brought up about organizations you're currently involved in or have been involved in or maybe will be involved in the future? Has it prompted you to think about anything? So just talk for, how many minutes? Say 3 to... 3-ish?
Yeah, 3 to 5.
3 to 5 minutes, and then we're going to just sort of ask people to popcorn and share any interesting things that you thought of or that people that you talked to mention.
Should we write things down?
I'll keep them up here.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, you get the idea. I might take this down and try to upload the handout while you guys are talking. Okay. And then, yeah, so go for it. Turn to a partner, 2 or 3 people, and have a conversation.
Nice.
Thank you. I know